As the world quiets and the stars begin to pierce the velvet sky, let your mind drift to a time when empires rose and fell under the weight of one man's ambition. Tonight, we journey into the life of Alexander the Great, a figure whose name echoes through the ages like a distant horn across the mountains. His story is one of conquest and dreams, of battles that shook the earth and a vision that stretched beyond the horizon. This is not just a tale of a king, but of a man who dared to chase the impossible, leaving footprints that time has yet to erase. So find a comfortable place, let the worries of the day slip away, and allow my voice to guide you through the ancient world, where cities burned, heroes were forged, and a young Macedonian changed the course of history. This video is crafted for those who seek the gentle embrace of history as they drift towards sleep. The tale of Alexander is vast, weaving through the rugged hills of Macedon, the sun-scorched deserts of Persia, and the distant rivers of India. Each moment is a thread in a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, told with a rhythm that soothes and captivates. Whether you're nestled under a blanket or gazing at the ceiling, let this story wrap around you like a warm hearth fire. And as we embark on this journey together, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this history unfold? What time is it there? Drop a comment below to share your corner of the world, and if you enjoy this tale, consider liking and subscribing to join our community of dreamers and storytellers. Your support keeps these stories alive, glowing like embers in the night. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. The wind howls through the craggy hills of Macedon, a land of shepherds and warriors, where the air carries the scent of pine and the promise of greatness. In the shadow of Mount Olympus, where the gods were said to dwell, a boy was born in 356 BC, destined to reshape the world. His name was Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, a child of prophecy and fire. Macedon was no gentle cradle. It was a rugged kingdom, its people hardened by the land's unyielding terrain, their hearts forged in the clash of bronze and ambition. To understand the man who would become Alexander the Great, we must first walk the dusty paths of his youth, where every step shaped the conqueror to come. Alexander's father, Philip, was a king of iron will, a man who transformed Macedon from a fractured backwater into a power that made even mighty Athens tremble. Philip's court in Pella buzzed with intrigue, its halls filled with warriors, poets, and schemers. Young Alexander grew up amid this restless energy, his eyes wide with the sight of phalanxes drilling in the courtyard, their spears glinting under the Macedonian sun. His mother, Olympias, was a woman of fierce spirit, her roots in the mystical land of Epirus. She whispered tales of gods and heroes to her son, filling his dreams with visions of Achilles, the swift-footed warrior of the Iliad. Olympias believed her son was no ordinary mortal, and her devotion bordered on the divine, as if she saw in him a spark of the heavens. From his earliest days, Alexander was no stranger to challenge. He was a boy of boundless energy, his mind as sharp as the Xiphos sword he would one day wield. At 10, he tamed a wild stallion named Bucephalus, a beast no man could break. The story is told that when the horse was brought before Philip, it reared and thrashed, untamed and fierce. But Alexander, watching keenly, noticed how the stallion shied from its own shadow. With a steady hand, he turned Bucephalus into the sun, calming the creature and mounting it with ease. Philip, watching his son, is said to have wept, declaring, "Macedon is too small for you, my boy." That moment, under the blazing sun, was a glimpse of the audacity that would define Alexander's life. His education was no less extraordinary. At 13, Philip summoned the philosopher Aristotle to tutor his son. In the quiet groves of Mieza, far from Pella's clamor, Aristotle opened the world to Alexander. He taught him of the stars, the laws of nature, and the words of Homer, whose Iliad became Alexander's guiding star. Aristotle spoke of the unity of all things, planting seeds of a dream that would one day drive Alexander to unite East and West. Yet even as a boy, Alexander was restless, his heart yearning for action. He once complained to his friends that his father was conquering all of Greece, leaving him no worlds to win. This hunger, this insatiable need to prove himself, was already burning within him. Life in Macedon was not without its shadows. The court was a nest of rivalries, and Alexander's place as heir was never certain. Philip's many marriages brought half-siblings who could challenge his claim, and whispers of plots swirled like dust in the wind. Olympias, fiercely protective, guarded her son's destiny with a mother's love and a priestess's zeal. She filled his nights with stories of divine lineage, claiming descent from Achilles and the gods themselves. Whether Alexander believed these tales or not, they wove themselves into his soul, giving him a sense of purpose that transcended mortal limits. He was not just a prince, he was a story waiting to unfold. As he grew, Alexander's bond with his companions deepened. Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and others became his confidants, their loyalty forged in the rough games of youth and the shared dreams of glory. These were no ordinary friends. They were the foundation of the army that would one day follow him to the ends of the earth. Together, they hunted in Macedon's wilds, their laughter echoing through the forests, their bonds tempered by the harsh discipline of Macedonian life. Alexander learned early that loyalty was a currency more precious than gold, and he spent it wisely, earning the devotion of men who would die for him. Yet, even in these early years, there were omens of the trials to come. The tensions between Philip and Olympias grew, their clashes like storms over the Aegean. Alexander, caught between them, felt the weight of their ambitions. Philip's conquests were reshaping Greece, but they also cast a long shadow over his son. Would Alexander merely inherit his father's world, or would he forge one of his own? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the young prince stood on the cusp of manhood. Macedon was a crucible, and Alexander was being shaped within it, his heart already reaching for horizons unknown. As the stars wheel above us now, imagine that boy, standing on a hill overlooking Pella, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. What dreams stirred in his heart? What fears whispered in the quiet of the night? The answers lie ahead, in a tale that will carry us from the hills of Macedon to the edge of the world. But for now, let the wind carry you forward into the next chapter of this story, where a king's death will set a prince's destiny ablaze. The sun sets over the rugged hills of Macedon, casting long shadows across the stone walls of Pella's palace. In this restless heart of the kingdom, a young Alexander stood, his gaze often turning southward, where his father, King Philip II, waged wars that would bind Greece under Macedonian might. To understand the fire that drove Alexander, we must first linger in the shadow of his father, a man whose ambition reshaped a fractured land and whose legacy both inspired and burdened his son. Philip was no ordinary king. He was a visionary, a warrior, and a politician whose iron hand forged a nation. Yet, for Alexander, Philip's towering presence was both a beacon and a chain, guiding him toward greatness while tethering him to a throne not yet his own. Philip II came to power in 359 BC, when Macedon was a land under siege, its borders harried by Illyrians, Thracians, and the ever-scheming Greek city-states to the south. The kingdom was a patchwork of tribes, its people fierce but disunited, its army a shadow of what it would become. Philip, barely 22, faced a kingdom on the brink of collapse. With a mind as sharp as his spear, he set to work, reforming the army into a disciplined machine. He introduced the sarissa, a pike longer than any in Greece, turning his phalanxes into impenetrable walls of death. He trained his men to march in unison, their shields locked, their steps echoing like thunder across the valleys. This was the Macedonian phalanx, a force that would one day carry Alexander to the ends of the earth. Beyond the battlefield, Philip was a master of diplomacy, wielding marriage and intrigue as deftly as he did his sword. He married often, binding rival tribes and foreign powers to Macedon through blood and alliance. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was one such bride, a princess from Epirus whose fiery spirit matched Philip's own. Their union was passionate but stormy, and Alexander, their only son, grew up in a court where love and rivalry intertwined. Philip's other marriages brought new wives and new heirs, each a potential threat to Alexander's claim. The young prince watched as his father's court became a chessboard, with queens and pawns vying for power under the king's watchful eye. Alexander was 16 when he first tasted the weight of his father's world. In 340 BC, Philip left him as regent in Pella while he campaigned against the Thracians. It was a test, and Alexander seized it with the hunger of youth. When a northern tribe, the Mede, rebelled, Alexander marched against them, crushed their resistance, and founded a city in their lands, naming it Alexandropolis. The victory was small but significant, a spark of the fire that would one day consume empires. Philip, returning to Pella, saw in his son a mirror of his own ambition, but also something more, a restless spirit that could not be contained by Macedon's borders. Yet the bond between father and son was fraught with tension. Philip's conquests were uniting Greece under the League of Corinth, a fragile alliance of city-states bowing to Macedonian might. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip's phalanx shattered the armies of Athens and Thebes, cementing his dominance. Alexander, just 18, led the left wing, commanding the elite companion cavalry. His charge broke the Theban sacred band, an elite force thought unbreakable, and the victory was a triumph for both father and son. But as Philip's star rose, so did the whispers of his plans for Persia, a campaign that would dwarf all he had done. Alexander, watching from the sidelines, felt the weight of a future he feared might belong to his father alone. The court at Pella grew darker as Philip's ambitions soared. His marriage to Cleopatra, a Macedonian noblewoman, sparked a rift that would echo through history. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, drunkenly toasted the hope of a legitimate heir, a barb aimed at Alexander and his Epirote mother. Furious, Alexander hurled a goblet at Attalus, and Philip, siding with his new kin, drew his sword on his son. The moment passed, but the wound lingered. Alexander and Olympias fled to Epirus, leaving Pella behind. Though they later returned, the trust between father and son was fractured, a crack that widened with every passing day. Philip's plans for Persia grew bolder. He sent an advance force across the Hellespont, preparing to challenge the vast empire of Darius III. The world watched, sensing a shift in the tides of power. But fate, as it so often does, turned on a single moment. In 336 BC, at a festival in Aegae, Philip strode into the theater, his golden crown gleaming, his guards deliberately absent to show his trust in his people. A young nobleman, Pausanias, stepped forward, his dagger flashing in the sunlight. The blade found Philip's heart, and the king fell, his blood staining the stones. Chaos erupted. Pausanias fled, only to be cut down by pursuing guards. Was it personal vengeance, a lover's quarrel, or a deeper plot? Some whispered of Olympia's hand, others of Alexander's ambition. The truth remains shrouded, a secret carried to the grave. Alexander was 20 when his father's body was laid upon the pyre. The throne of Macedon was his, but so was the weight of a kingdom on the edge of fracture. Greece stirred, sensing weakness. Rivals eyed the crown. And beyond the sea, Persia waited, vast and unyielding. As the flames consumed Philip's body, Alexander stood silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. What thoughts raced through his mind? Was it grief for a father lost, or the fire of a destiny now within reach? The answer lies in the steps he would take next, as a prince became a king, and a king became a legend. The pyre's embers still glowed in Aegae as Alexander, barely 20, stood at the precipice of a throne forged in blood and ambition. The year was 336 BC, and Macedon mourned its fallen king, Philip II, struck down in a moment that shook the world. Yet grief was a luxury Alexander could not afford. The kingdom he inherited was a blade, sharp and gleaming, but balanced on a fragile edge. To the south, the Greek city-states, Athens, Thebes, and their allies, chafed under Macedonian rule, their pride bruised by Philip's victories. To the north and east, barbarian tribes sensed weakness, their spears restless. And across the sea, the vast Persian Empire loomed, its wealth and power a siren's call to a young king with dreams too large for the rugged hills of his homeland. This was Alexander's moment, and the world watched to see if he would rise or crumble under the weight of his father's crown. In Pella, the air was thick with whispers. Philip's death had left a void, and the court buzzed with intrigue. Rivals, nobles with claims to power, generals with their own ambitions, circled like wolves. Alexander moved swiftly, his youth belying a mind honed by Aristotle and tempered by years in his father's shadow. He secured the loyalty of the army, the backbone of Macedonian power, with promises of glory and the weight of his presence. The soldiers, who had seen him charge at Chaeronea, roared their approval, their sarissas raised to the sky. But loyalty was a flame that needed tending, and Alexander knew the throne was his only if he could hold it. The first challenge came from within. Philip's alliances, built on marriages and treaties, began to fray. Attalus, the uncle of Philip's last wife, Cleopatra, had fled, but his faction lingered, whispering of other heirs. Alexander acted with ruthless precision. He purged the court of those whose loyalty wavered, their fates sealed in quiet executions or banishments to distant hills. Olympias, his mother, returned from Epirus, her eyes blazing with a vengeance only a mother could wield. Stories tell of her hand in the death of Cleopatra and her infant, ensuring no rival heir would threaten her son. Whether true or not, these acts cast a shadow over Alexander's early reign, a reminder that kingship demanded not just courage but cruelty. To the south, Greece stirred. Thebes, Athens, and other city-states saw Philip's death as a chance to throw off the Macedonian yoke. The League of Corinth, Philip's fragile alliance, began to crack. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator who had long railed against Macedon, stood in the Agora, mocking Alexander as a boy unfit to rule. Thebes openly rebelled, their warriors gathering in defiance. Alexander, hearing these reports in Pella, did not hesitate. He marched south with a speed that stunned his enemies, his army a storm of hooves and steel. By late 336 BC, he stood before Thebes, his phalanxes arrayed like a wall of iron. Thebes expected negotiation, perhaps mercy. They received neither. Alexander demanded surrender, but the Thebans, proud and defiant, refused. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. The Macedonian phalanx, trained to perfection under Philip, ground through Theban lines, while Alexander's companion cavalry, led by his trusted friend Hephaestion, shattered their flanks. The city fell, and Alexander's wrath was unyielding. Thebes was razed, its walls torn down, its people enslaved or scattered, save for the house of the poet Pindar, spared in a rare nod to culture. The destruction was a message to Greece. Alexander was no boy, but a king who would brook no defiance. Athens, watching from afar, quailed. Demosthenes' fiery speeches faltered, and the city sent envoys, their words dripping with submission. Alexander accepted their surrender, but his eyes were already elsewhere. The Greek city-states were subdued, the League of Corinth reaffirmed under his iron grip. Yet the victory felt hollow, a mere prelude to the destiny that called him. Philip had dreamed of Persia, of challenging the great King Darius III, whose empire stretched from the Hellespont to the distant rivers of India. Alexander, standing amid the ruins of Thebes, felt that dream pulse in his veins. But first he turned north, to the wild lands of Thrace and Illyria, where tribes emboldened by Philip's death tested his resolve. In 335 BC, Alexander marched into the Balkans, his army threading through mountain passes where ambushes lurked. The Triballi and Illyrians, fierce warriors of the north, met him with spears and defiance. At the Battle of Mount Haemus, Alexander's tactics shone. He outmaneuvered the tribes, using the terrain to his advantage, his cavalry sweeping down like a hawk on its prey. The campaign was swift, the victories decisive. City-states and tribes alike learned that this young king was no mere shadow of his father, but a force of nature, relentless and unyielding. As he returned to Pella, Alexander's mind turned to the east. Philip's advance force, sent to Asia Minor, still held a foothold across the Hellespont, but Persia's armies were stirring. The great King Darius, vast in wealth and power, was no phantom to be dismissed. Alexander stood at a crossroads. To remain a king of Macedon, secure but limited, or to chase a dream that could burn him to ash. His companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Parmenion, gathered around him, their loyalty a fire that warmed the cold nights. The world beyond the sea was vast, unknown, and perilous. Yet in Alexander's heart there was no question. The path was clear, and it led to glory. As the stars rise above us now, picture that young king, his armor glinting in the torchlight, his eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. What drove him to step beyond the safety of his throne? Was it the ghost of his father, urging him to surpass all that had come before? Or was it something deeper, a fire that burned only for him? The answer waits across the sea, where a river runs red with the blood of his first great battle. The Hellespont shimmered under the spring sun of 334 BC, its waters a threshold between the known world and the vast empire of Persia. Alexander, now 22, stood on the shores of Asia Minor, his army of 40,000 men arrayed behind him, their armor catching the light like a field of stars. Macedon was secure, Greece subdued, and the northern tribes quelled, but this was no longer a campaign to hold a throne. This was a leap into the unknown, a challenge to the might of Darius III, the great king whose dominion stretched from the Aegean to the distant Indus. As Alexander stepped onto the soil of Asia, he drove his spear into the earth, claiming it as his own. The gesture was bold, almost reckless, a declaration that he would not merely fight Persia but conquer it. The first test of that ambition would come at the Granicus River, where blood and water would mingle under the Macedonian banner. Alexander's army was a marvel, forged by Philip's genius and sharpened by his son's vision. The phalanx with its towering sarissas formed the anvil, while the companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, was the hammer. With him rode his trusted companions, Hephaestion, his closest friend, Parmenion, the grizzled veteran, and Cleitus, whose loyalty was as fierce as his temper. They were not just soldiers but brothers, bound by years of shared dreams and dangers. Across the river waited a Persian army, led by satraps of Asia Minor, bolstered by Greek mercenaries who had chosen gold over loyalty to Hellas. The Persians numbered perhaps 20,000, their ranks glittering with wealth, their cavalry renowned for its speed. They held the high bank of the Granicus, a narrow river cutting through the plains, daring Alexander to cross. The march to the Granicus was swift, Alexander's army moving with a discipline that unnerved the Persians. Scouts brought word of the enemy's position, and Parmenion, ever cautious, urged his young king to wait until dawn, to cross under cover of darkness. But Alexander, his eyes alight with a fire that seemed to burn from within, dismissed the advice. To wait was to doubt, and doubt was a luxury he could not afford. He ordered the army to advance, the sun still high, the river gleaming like a blade. The Persians watched, confident that the steep banks would break any assault. But Alexander saw not an obstacle but an opportunity, a stage for his destiny to unfold. The battle began with a feint. Alexander sent a small force under Amyntas to probe the Persian left, drawing their cavalry forward. Then, with a cry that echoed across the plain, he led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge across the river. The water churned, hooves pounding. As the Macedonians splashed through the shallows, their spears lowered. The Persians met them with a hail of javelins, and men fell, their blood staining the Granicus red. Alexander, unmistakable in his plumed helmet, was a whirlwind, his sword flashing as he cut through the enemy ranks. A Persian noble, Rhoseis's, aimed a blow at his head, but Alexander's armor held, and he struck the man down with a single stroke. Moments later, another, Spithridates, raised his blade, only for Cleitus to intervene, saving his king with a swift cut. The Persian line wavered, their cavalry no match for the Macedonian onslaught. The phalanx, advancing behind, locked shields and drove forward, their sarissas a forest of death. The Greek mercenaries, abandoned by their Persian allies, fought bravely but were surrounded. Alexander offered them no quarter. Their betrayal of Greece was a wound he would not forgive. By dusk, the field was his. Thousands of Persians lay dead, their bodies strewn along the riverbank, while Macedonian losses were few. The victory was not just a triumph of arms, but a statement. Alexander was a force the world had not seen before. In the aftermath, he honored his fallen with lavish burials, sending the spoils of battle to Athens as a gesture to the Greeks. The Greek mercenaries' survivors were enslaved, a harsh reminder of the cost of disloyalty. Alexander's generosity and ruthlessness were two sides of the same coin, each act calculated to build his legend. He moved south, liberating Greek cities along the Ionian coast, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, welcoming them as allies rather than subjects. The people, long under Persian rule, greeted him as a liberator, their voices rising in the agora as they crowned him with laurels. Yet Alexander's heart was restless. The Granicus was but the first step, a spark in a fire that would consume empires. As he marched deeper into Asia Minor, the land unfolded before him, its cities ancient, its people wary yet curious. The Persian satraps retreated, their confidence shaken, while Darius, far in his palace at Susa, began to stir. Alexander's companions, gathered around campfires at night, spoke of the battles to come, their voices low but eager. Hephaestion, ever at Alexander's side, shared his dreams of a world united, while Parmenion cautioned restraint. The king listened, but his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where greater challenges waited. The Granicus had tested his mettle, but it was a river, not an empire. What lay ahead was a knot, both literal and figurative, that would demand all his cunning to unravel. As the night deepens around us, imagine that young king, standing on a hill overlooking the Granicus, the river now quiet, its waters reflecting the stars. What thoughts stirred in his heart as he surveyed the battlefield? Did he see the faces of the fallen, or did his mind already race toward the next challenge, a puzzle that would test his destiny? The answer lies in a legend that awaits, where a single stroke will cut through the impossible. The dust of Asia Minor settled behind Alexander's army as they marched inland, the year 334 BC drawing to a close. The Granicus River lay behind them, its waters a memory of victory, but the road ahead wound through the heart of Phrygia, where ancient cities whispered tales older than Macedon itself. Alexander, now 22, moved with the certainty of a man touched by fate, his eyes fixed on the vast empire of Persia. Yet, before he could face the great King Darius, a challenge of a different kind awaited in the city of Gordium, a puzzle wrapped in legend, a knot that held the promise of destiny. Here, in the shadow of an ancient ox cart, Alexander would confront a mystery that would echo through the ages, a moment where myth and ambition intertwined under the watchful gaze of the gods. Gordium was no grand metropolis like Athens or Susa, but a quiet city nestled in the highlands, its streets lined with stone and stories. At its heart stood a relic from a bygone age, an ox cart, its yoke bound by a knot so intricate no man could unravel it. The tale, passed down through generations, spoke of Phrygia's first king, Gordias, a humble farmer chosen by an oracle to rule. His cart, tied with a knot of cornel bark, was said to carry a prophecy. Whoever could undo its tangle would rule Asia, their name carved into the annals of time. For centuries, kings and sages had tried and failed, their fingers faltering against the knot's unyielding loops. Now Alexander, the young king of Macedon, stood before it, his companions gathered, the air thick with expectation. The knot was more than a challenge, it was a test of the divine. Alexander, raised on Olympia's tales of gods and heroes, felt the weight of the moment. His victories at Granicus had shaken Persia's grip on Asia Minor, but this was no battle of swords. The Phrygians watched, their eyes curious, while his men, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and the grizzled Parmenion, stood silent, sensing the significance of what was to come. Alexander studied the knot, its cords twisted like the coils of a serpent, defying logic and patience. Some say he traced its loops with his fingers, searching for a beginning, while others claim he stood motionless, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The truth, like the knot itself, is tangled in time. What followed became legend. Alexander, impatient with riddles or perhaps guided by a spark of inspiration, drew his sword. With a single, decisive stroke, he sliced through the knot, its cords falling away like a spell broken. The crowd gasped, then cheered, their voices rising to the heavens. Was it a solution or a defiance of the prophecy's rules? The priests of Gordium declared it fulfilled, proclaiming Alexander the destined ruler of Asia. His companions, ever loyal, saw in the act the audacity that defined their king, a man who did not unravel problems but cut through them, reshaping the world to fit his will. The story of the Gordian knot spread like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers across the empire. To some, it was proof of Alexander's divine favor, a sign that Zeus or Apollo guided his hand. To others, it was a warning. This was a king who would not be bound by tradition or impossibility. As he left Gordium, the city's oracle whispered of his destiny, and Alexander, perhaps for the first time, felt the weight of a world that might one day be his. Yet the knot was but a prelude, a moment of clarity before the storm of conquest resumed. The Persian satraps, regrouping in the south, prepared to meet him, and the city of Tyre, proud and defiant, stood like a fortress against his path. Alexander's march continued, his army swelling with allies from the liberated cities of Ionia. The coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus had fallen, though not without resistance. At Halicarnassus, Memnon, a Greek mercenary in Persian service, had burned the city rather than yield it fully, a reminder that Persia's wealth could still buy defiance. Alexander, undeterred, pressed on, his mind already turning to the challenges ahead. The knot had been a symbol, but the true test lay in the cities and armies that awaited. His companions, sharing wine under the Phrygian stars, spoke of the battles to come, their voices a mix of excitement and unease. Hephaestion, ever the dreamer, saw a world united under Alexander's banner, while Parmenion cautioned of the perils of overreaching. The act at Gordium was more than a moment. It was a mirror of Alexander's soul. He was a man who saw obstacles not as barriers, but as invitations, each one a chance to prove his greatness. The knot, like the Granicus, was a step toward a dream that grew larger with every victory. Yet as he marched south, the shadow of Darius loomed. The great king was no longer a distant figure but a force gathering in the east, his armies vast, his wealth unimaginable. Alexander's men, hardened by months of campaign, felt the weight of what lay ahead. The knot had been cut, but the path to Asia's heart was paved with stone and blood. As the night wraps around us, picture Alexander standing before that ancient cart, his sword gleaming in the torchlight, the knot's severed ends at his feet. What did he feel in that moment? Triumph, defiance, or the quiet stir of doubt? Did he sense the eyes of history upon him? Or was his mind already racing toward the sea, where a city on an island would test his will like never before? The answer lies in the waves that crash against Tyre, where a king's ambition will meet the unyielding stone of a fortress city. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the shores of Phoenicia in 332 BC, its light glinting off the waves that lapped at the walls of Tyre, a city that seemed to defy the very sea itself. Perched on an island half a mile from the mainland, Tyre was a jewel of commerce, its harbors bustling with ships, its markets rich with silks and spices from distant lands. Its walls, rising sheer from the water, had never been breached, and its people, proud descendants of Phoenician sailors, believed their city untouchable. Alexander, now 24, stood on the shore, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette. The Gordian knot had fallen to his sword, but Tyre was no riddle to be cut. It was a fortress that mocked his ambition. To conquer Persia, he needed the sea, and to claim the sea, Tyre must fall. What followed was a siege that would test his ingenuity, his resolve, and the limits of human endurance. Tyre was more than a city. It was a symbol of defiance. Its king, Asmolcus, and its council, backed by the might of Persia, refused Alexander's demand for surrender. They trusted their walls, their fleet, and the sea that separated them from the Macedonian army. Alexander, however, saw not an obstacle but a canvas for his will. His engineers, led by Diodes of Pella, proposed a plan as audacious as their king. To build a causeway, a mole, stretching across the half-mile of water to Tyre's walls. The army, hardened by victories at Granicus and beyond, set to work, hauling stones from the mainland and timber from the forests of Lebanon. The sea churned, the sun blazed, and yet the Macedonians twalled, their king among them, his hands calloused, his voice urging them onward. The Tyrians were not idle. From their walls they watched the causeway grow, a slender arm of earth reaching toward them. They sent fire ships, blazing with pitch, to burn the Macedonian works, their flames lighting the night sky. Divers swam beneath the waves, cutting ropes that anchored Alexander's siege towers. Archers rained arrows, and catapults hurled stones, forcing the Macedonians to shield their labor with hides and wooden screens. The sea itself seemed to fight for Tyre, its currents sweeping away debris, its storms battering the causeway. Yet Alexander's will was as unyielding as the stone they piled. When the Tyrians mocked him with jeers from their walls, he answered with action, his engineers devising new machines, towers mounted on ships, battering rams that shook the sea. Months passed, the causeway inching closer, but Alexander's patience was not infinite. He sought allies, summoning the fleets of Sidon and Byblos, Phoenician cities that had already bent the knee. With their ships, he blockaded Tyre's harbors, cutting off its supplies. The Tyrians, now desperate, resorted to grim measures. They sacrificed to their god Melkart, and some whispered of darker rites, of children offered to appease the heavens. Alexander, hearing these tales, pressed harder, his heart torn between pity and resolve. He offered terms, promising mercy if Tyre surrendered, but the city's defiance held firm, its people believing the sea would save them. The final assault came in July 332 BC, after 7 months of siege. Alexander's causeway had reached the walls, and his fleet closed in, their rams pounding the fortifications. The Macedonians launched a 3-pronged attack, from the causeway, from ships, and from a breach in the southern wall. Alexander led the charge himself, scaling a ladder under a hail of arrows, his shield raised, his companions at his side. The Tyrians fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, hurling boiling oil and molten sand, but the Macedonian tide was relentless. The walls fell, and the city was breached. The slaughter that followed was brutal, 8,000 Tyrians dead, their streets running red, though Alexander spared those who sought refuge in the temple of Melkart. In the aftermath, Alexander stood atop Tyre's walls, the sea stretching endless before him. The city, once a bastion, was now his, its harbors open to his fleet. He honored his fallen with solemn rites, but his gaze was already eastward, toward Egypt and the heart of Persia. The causeway, a marvel of engineering, remained, a scar on the sea that would one day silt into a peninsula binding Tyre to the mainland forever. His companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and the steadfast Parmenion marveled at the feat, but also saw the toll it had taken. The army, exhausted, yearned for rest, yet Alexander's fire burned brighter than ever. Tyre's fall was a turning point, a testament to Alexander's ability to bend the impossible to his will. The Phoenician coast was his, and with it, the sea routes to Persia's heart. Yet the victory came at a cost, not just in lives, but in the growing weight of expectation. His men followed him, their loyalty unshaken, but whispers began to stir. How far would their king push them? The answer lay southward, in a land of sands and oracles, where a new chapter of his legend awaited. As Alexander turned his eyes to Egypt, he carried the weight of Tyre's walls, a reminder that every triumph carved a deeper mark on his soul. As the stars gleam above us now, imagine that young king, standing on the conquered ramparts of Tyre, the sea whispering secrets at his feet. Did he feel the thrill of victory, or the quiet ache of what it had cost? Did he hear the call of a distant oracle, promising answers to questions he had yet to ask? The answer lies in the sands of Egypt, where a god's voice will speak his name. The desert wind sighed across the sands of Egypt in 331 BC, carrying the scent of eternity as Alexander's army marched southward from Tyre. The Mediterranean's blue gave way to an ocean of dunes, where the sun burned with a fierceness that tested even the hardiest Macedonian. Alexander, now 24, moved with a purpose that seemed to outpace the horizon itself. The fall of Tyre had secured the Phoenician coast, but Egypt was no mere conquest. It was a land of ancient gods and timeless mysteries, a place where pharaohs were revered as divine. For Alexander, it was a chance to weave his name into the tapestry of a civilization older than Macedon's hills, to seek answers to questions that stirred in his soul. As he crossed the Sinai, the weight of his victories mingled with the whispers of an oracle, calling him to a destiny beyond mortal ken. Egypt was unlike any land Alexander had known. Its rivers, fed by the life-giving Nile, cradled cities that had stood for millennia. Memphis, with its towering temples, and Pelusium, its gateway fortress, welcomed him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The Persian satrap, Mazaces, surrendered without a fight, his forces dwarfed by the Macedonian tide, and his people weary of Persian rule. The Egyptians, long chafing under the yoke of Darius III, saw in Alexander a figure from their own prophecies, a deliverer, perhaps even a god. He entered Memphis in triumph, crowned with garlands, his army marveling at the colossal statues and the scent of lotus in the air. Here, in the shadow of the pyramids, Alexander offered sacrifices to Apis, the sacred bull, honoring Egypt's gods as if they were his own. But Alexander's heart was restless, drawn not to the comforts of Memphis, but to the edge of the known world. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, at a place where the Nile's delta kissed the sea. He named it Alexandria, envisioning a beacon of Greek culture that would blend east and west. Walking the site, he traced its boundaries with barley flour, his companions at his side, Hephaestion dreaming of libraries, Ptolemy sketching plans for harbors. When birds swooped down to eat the grain, the priests declared it a sign of prosperity, foretelling a city that would outshine even Athens. Alexander, standing on the shore, saw not just a city but a bridge to his dream of a unified world. Yet it was not Alexandria that called to him most urgently, but a distant oracle in the desert of Siwa. The shrine of Amun, nestled in an oasis amidst endless sands, was said to speak with the voice of a god. Kings and heroes had sought its wisdom, and Alexander, haunted by Olympia's tales of divine lineage, felt its pull. The journey was perilous, a march across a sea of dunes where mirages danced and water was a fleeting dream. His guides, Bedouin trackers, led the way, navigating by stars and instinct. The army, hardened by years of campaign, followed their king, though some whispered of madness. When a sudden rain fell, rare in that parched land, and ravens guided them to the oasis, the men saw it as a sign. The gods walked with Alexander. At Siwa, the temple of Amun stood like a sentinel, its priests cloaked in white, their eyes heavy with the weight of ancient secrets. Alexander entered alone, leaving even Hephaestion behind to face the oracle's voice. What questions he asked remain a mystery, locked in the sands of time. Did he seek confirmation of his divine birth, as Olympias had claimed, a son of Zeus rather than Philip? Did he ask of his destiny, of the empires he might conquer? The priests, speaking in riddles, declared him the son of Amunzeus, a god among men. Alexander emerged, his face unreadable, but those who knew him saw a new light in his eyes, a certainty that bordered on the divine. The pronouncement at Siwa was no mere ritual. It was a pivot in Alexander's soul. He was no longer just a king, but a figure straddling the mortal and the divine, a man whose ambition could reshape the heavens. The Egyptians crowned him pharaoh, their rituals enveloping him in the mantle of Horus, the god-king. He accepted their honors, but his gaze was already turning eastward, toward the heart of Persia, where Darius III awaited. The oracle's words had kindled a fire, but they also cast a shadow. His companions, loyal but human, began to wonder, how does one follow a man who believes himself a god? Alexander lingered in Egypt only long enough to set its governance, appointing trusted generals and leaving Ptolemy to oversee Alexandria's rise. The Nile's embrace had given him legitimacy, a navy, and a foothold in Africa, but the true prize lay beyond the Euphrates. Darius was gathering an army, vast and glittering, to meet the Macedonian upstart who had dared to challenge his empire. As Alexander marched out of Egypt, the desert wind at his back, he carried the weight of Siwa's prophecy. The next battle would not be for cities or coasts, but for the soul of an empire. As the night settles around us, picture Alexander standing in the oasis of Siwa, the oracle's words echoing in his heart, the stars above mirroring the fire within. Did he feel the weight of divinity, or the loneliness of a path no one else could tread? Did he sense the shadow of a great king, waiting to meet him on a field where empires would clash? The answer lies at Gaugamela, where the fate of Asia will be decided under a blood-red dawn. The plains of Mesopotamia stretched vast and golden under the autumn sun of 331 BC, a land where rivers carved life into the dust and empires rose and fell like tides. Alexander, now 25, led his army eastward from Egypt, the oracle's words at Siwa still ringing in his heart. a son of Zeus, destined to rule. The Mediterranean's shores, Tyre's walls, and Egypt's sands were behind him, each victory a stepping stone toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Now near the village of Gaugamela, he faced his greatest test. Darius III, the great king, whose army was a sea of spears and chariots, outnumbering the Macedonians nearly 3-1. This was no mere battle. It was a clash of worlds, where the fate of Asia hung in the balance, and Alexander's ambition would meet the full might of Persia's ancient power. Darius had learned from his defeat at Issus, where Alexander had routed him 2 years prior. The great king chose his ground carefully, a wide, flat plain near the Tigris, smoothed to favor his scythe-wheeled chariots and vast cavalry. His army, perhaps 100,000 strong, was a tapestry of the empire. Persian immortals, clad in gold and iron, Bactrian horsemen, swift as the wind, and Indian elephants, their trumpets shaking the earth. Greek mercenaries, hardened by war, stood among them, their loyalty bought with Persian gold. Darius positioned his forces with precision, his center a wall of spears, his flanks stretching beyond sight. At night, he kept his army in formation, their campfires a constellation of defiance, daring Alexander to come. Alexander's force, some 40,000 men, was dwarfed but undaunted. The Macedonian phalanx, with its sarissas gleaming, was the spine of his army, while the companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, was its beating heart. His generals, Parmenion, Cleitus, Ptolemy, knew the odds, their faces etched with the weight of what lay ahead. Scouts reported the Persian numbers, and Parmenion, ever the voice of caution, urged a night attack to disrupt Darius's lines. But Alexander refused, his eyes bright with a fire that seemed to burn through doubt. "I will not steal victory," he declared, choosing to face Darius in the light of day, where glory could be won openly. He slept soundly that night, a king at peace with his destiny, while his men sharpened their spears under the stars. Dawn broke over Gaugamela on October 1, 331 BC, the air thick with dust and tension. Alexander arrayed his army in a slanted formation, the phalanx angled to protect the flanks, his cavalry poised like a drawn bow. He rode Bucephalus, his black stallion, his plumed helmet a beacon to his men. The Persians struck first, their chariots thundering forward, scythes flashing. But Alexander's engineers had prepared, scattering caltrops to lame the horses and opening gaps in the phalanx to funnel the chariots into traps. The Macedonian archers loosed volleys, and the chariots faltered, their menace broken. Alexander saw his moment. The Persian left under Bessus, overextended, leaving a gap in their line. With a cry, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a wedge, charging straight for Darius's center. The phalanx held firm, pinning the Persian infantry, while Parmenion's flank battled fiercely against overwhelming odds. The Macedonian cavalry struck like lightning, cutting through to Darius's royal guard. The great king, towering in his golden chariot, saw the Macedonian king bearing down, his spear aimed like a god's judgment. Panic seized Darius, and he fled, his chariot racing across the plain, abandoning his army to chaos. The Persian lines collapsed, their vast numbers no match for Macedonian discipline and Alexander's daring. The slaughter was immense, tens of thousands falling under Macedonian blades, while Alexander's losses were fewer than 1,000. Parmenion's flank, hard-pressed, was relieved as the Persians broke, their retreat a tide of despair. Alexander pursued, his cavalry relentless, but Darius slipped away into the night, a king without a throne. By day's end, Gaugamela was Alexander's, and with it, the heart of Persia, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, lay open, their gates unguarded, their treasures his for the taking. Babylon welcomed him as a liberator, its people lining the streets with flowers, its priests chanting his name as a new king of Asia. Susa followed, its vaults spilling gold and jewels that dwarfed Macedon's wealth. In Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, Alexander gazed upon the palace of Xerxes, its columns soaring like a forest of stone. Some say he burned it, a torch thrown in vengeance for Persia's ancient wars against Greece. Others claim it was an accident, a drunken revel gone awry. Whatever the truth, the flames lit the sky, a beacon of Alexander's triumph and a warning to those who defied him. Yet victory brought no rest. Darius, though broken, was still alive, fleeing to the empire's eastern reaches. Alexander's men, weary from years of march and battle, felt the weight of their king's ambition. Hephaestion, ever loyal, shared his dreams of a world united, while Parmenian's eyes grew heavy with unspoken fears. Gaugamela had won an empire, but it had also set Alexander on a path from which there was no turning back. As he stood amid Persepolis' ruins, his thoughts turned to the fugitive king, a shadow that haunted his victory. As the night enfolds us, picture Alexander in the ashes of Persepolis, the flames casting shadows on his face, his eyes searching the horizon. Did he see the empire he had won, or the man he must still chase? Did he feel the weight of a crown that now spanned continents, or the pull of a destiny yet unfulfilled? The answer lies in the mountains and plains beyond, where a king's flight will lead to a tragedy that echoes through time. The winds of 330 BC carried the scent of conquest across the Persian heartland, where the ashes of Persepolis still smoldered and the wealth of an empire filled Macedonian coffers. Alexander, now 25, stood as the undisputed master of Babylon, Susa, and the ancient palaces of Persia. Yet his heart was restless, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where Darius III, the great king, fled like a shadow before the dawn. Gaugamela had broken Persia's armies, but Darius's escape was a wound to Alexander's ambition. A king without a throne, yet still a symbol of resistance. The pursuit that followed would lead Alexander through mountains and deserts, testing not only his army's endurance, but the very limits of his dream to unite the world under one crown. Darius had fled to Ecbatana, the ancient Median capital nestled in the Zagros Mountains, its walls a refuge for a king stripped of his glory. He gathered what remained of his court, nobles, guards, and the traitor Bessus, satrap of Bactria, whose ambition burned as fiercely as Alexander's own. The great king's plan was to retreat further east, to the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, where rugged terrain and fierce tribes might shield him. Alexander, learning of this, set out from Persepolis with a speed that left his baggage trains behind. His army, now a blend of Macedonians, Greeks, and Persian allies, marched through the Persian gates, a narrow pass where a small force could have held him at bay. But the gates were open, Darius's resolve crumbling like the empire he once ruled. The chase was relentless. Alexander's men, hardened by years of campaign, crossed rivers swollen with spring melt and mountains dusted with snow. The royal road, built by Persian kings to bind their empire, now served their conqueror, its stone paths echoing with the tramp of Macedonian boots. Scouts brought word of Darius's movements, his retinue shrinking as nobles deserted, their loyalty as fleeting as the gold they carried. Alexander pushed harder, his companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cleitus, riding at his side, their faces weathered but resolute. The army marched by day and night, resting only when exhaustion demanded it, their king's fire driving them beyond human limits. In the summer of 330 BC, near Hecatompilos, Alexander closed the gap. Darius's camp was in disarray, his followers dwindling to a few thousand. But Bessus, seeing opportunity in chaos, acted with cold treachery. He and his allies seized Darius, binding the great king in chains, a prisoner in his own empire. When Alexander's vanguard drew near, Bessus struck the final blow, plunging a dagger into Darius's heart. The conspirators fled, leaving their king to die in a dusty wagon, his blood soaking the earth. Alexander arrived too late, finding only a body, the once mighty ruler reduced to a tragic figure, abandoned by those he trusted. The sight stirred something in Alexander, grief, perhaps, or respect for a fallen foe. He covered Darius's body with his own cloak, ordering a royal burial in Persepolis, honoring the man whose throne he had claimed. The death of Darius marked a turning point, but not an end. Alexander declared himself the great king, heir to the Achaemenid legacy, yet his claim was hollow while Bessus lived. The traitor proclaimed himself king, rallying Bactria's warriors under the name Artaxerxes V. Alexander, now both hunter and king, turned his army eastward into the wilds of Central Asia. The terrain was unforgiving, deserts that burned by day and froze by night, mountains that clawed at the sky. The tribes of Hyrcania and Parthia, fierce and untamed, struck from ambush, their arrows a constant menace. Alexander countered with diplomacy as often as force, offering mercy to those who bent the knee, blending Persian nobles into his court to bind the empire's wounds. Yet the pursuit took its toll. The Macedonian army, once a tight-knit band, grew strained, their ranks swollen with new allies who spoke strange tongues. Parmenion, the old general, voiced concerns, his caution clashing with Alexander's relentless drive. Cleitus, loyal but blunt, grumbled at the adoption of Persian customs. Alexander now wore the diadem and robes of a Persian king, a choice that rankled his Macedonian core. Hephaestion alone seemed to understand, sharing Alexander's vision of a world where East and West were one. The army marched on, through the Caspian gates and into the satrapy of Aria, where betrayal and rebellion simmered. A shadow fell over the campaign when Alexander learned of a plot. Philotas, Parmenion's son and a commander of the companion cavalry, was accused of conspiring against the king. The evidence was thin, but Alexander, ever vigilant, acted swiftly. Philotas was tried and executed, his cries of innocence lost in the wind. Parmenion, loyal but now suspect, was killed in Ecbatana, a decision that chilled the army's heart. The act was ruthless, a reminder that Alexander's trust was a fragile thing. His men followed, but whispers grew. Was their king becoming something else, a ruler more Persian than Macedonian? As Alexander pressed deeper into Asia, the pursuit of Bessus became a quest for more than vengeance. It was a journey into the unknown, where every step tested the bonds of loyalty and the limits of ambition. The empire was his, but it was vast, unwieldy, and fractious. The mountains of Bactria loomed, their peaks hiding a foe who would not yield easily. Alexander, standing over Darius's grave, felt the weight of a crown that spanned continents, yet knew the path ahead was fraught with peril. As the stars burn above us, imagine Alexander kneeling beside that bloodied wagon, the great king's cloak in his hands, the desert stretching endless around him. Did he mourn the man he had chased, or did he see in Darius's fall a mirror of his own mortality? Did he sense the battles yet to come, in lands where even his fire might falter? The answer lies in the rugged heart of Central Asia, where a new kind of war awaits. The winds of 329 BC howled through the jagged peaks of Central Asia, where the earth itself seemed to resist the tread of Alexander's army. The heart of Persia, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, was his, and Darius III lay dead, his empire shattered. Yet Alexander, now 26, found no rest in victory. The traitor Bessus, self-proclaimed king of Persia, had fled to the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions where mountains touched the sky and tribes bowed to no man. This was no land for phalanxes or grand battles. It was a realm of shadows, where loyalty shifted like sand and every pass hid an ambush. Alexander's pursuit of Bessus drew him into the unknown, a crucible that would test his army's endurance, his vision of empire, and the very core of his being. Bactria and Sogdiana were a world apart from the marble halls of Persepolis. Their vast plains gave way to rugged cliffs, their rivers ran cold from mountain snows, and their people, nomads and warriors, lived by codes older than any empire. Alexander's army, now a mosaic of Macedonians, Greeks, and Persian recruits, marched through deserts where the sun scorched the earth by day and frost bit at night. Supplies dwindled, and the men, who had once dreamed of glory, now muttered of home. Hephaestion, ever at Alexander's side, shared his vision of a world united, but even he felt the strain. Ptolemy, pragmatic and loyal, organized the supply lines, while the absence of Parmenion, executed in the wake of his son's conspiracy, left a void no general could fill. The campaign began with a grueling march through the Hindu Kush, its passes choked with snow. Alexander led from the front, his cloak tattered, his breath visible in the freezing air. The men followed, their trust in their king outweighing their exhaustion. Bessus, believing the mountains impenetrable, fortified Bactra, the region's capital. But Alexander, as ever, defied the impossible. He crossed the peaks in spring, his army emerging like a storm to find Bessus unprepared. The traitor fled further north, to Sogdiana, burning villages to slow his pursuer. Alexander pressed on, his will of fire that warmed his men even as their boots bled. The war that followed was unlike any Alexander had fought. The Sogdians, led by chieftains like Spitamenes, waged a guerrilla campaign, striking from hills and vanishing into the steppe. Their horsemen, swift and elusive, harried Macedonian outposts, cutting supply lines and sowing fear. Alexander adapted, dividing his army into mobile units, building fortresses to secure the land. He founded cities, Alexandrias in the wilderness, populating them with Greek settlers and local tribes, a blend of cultures meant to anchor his empire. Yet, the locals resisted, their loyalty tied to clan and custom, not a distant king. Skirmishes bled into months, each victory hard-won, each loss a reminder of the land's defiance. In 328 BC, Bessus was betrayed by his own allies, handed over to Alexander in chains. The Macedonian king, now clad in Persian robes, sentenced him to a traitor's death, mutilated and executed, a grim warning to others. Yet, Bessus's fall did not end the war. Spitamenes, more cunning than Bessus, continued the fight, his raids a thorn in Alexander's side. At the Battle of the Polytimetus River, a Macedonian detachment was ambushed, suffering heavy losses. The defeat, rare for Alexander, stung his pride, and he led a swift counterattack, crushing Spitamenes' forces. The Sogdian leader fled, only to be killed by his own allies, his head sent to Alexander as a peace offering. Amid the fighting, Alexander's vision of empire took shape. He married Roxana, daughter of a Sogdian noble, a union meant to bind east and west. The wedding, held under starlit skies, was a moment of hope, with Roxana's beauty said to rival the moon. Yet it deepened the rift with his Macedonians, who saw their king drift further into Persian ways. At a banquet in Samarkand, tensions boiled over. Cleitus, the loyal companion who had saved Alexander at Granicus, drank deeply and spoke bitterly of the king's new customs. Words turned to shouts, and Alexander, in a rage, seized a spear and struck Cleitus dead. The act was a wound, not just to Cleitus's friends, but to Alexander's soul. He wept for days, refusing food, haunted by the loss of a man who had been a brother. The incident cast a shadow over the campaign. The army, stretched across thousands of miles, grew weary, their loyalty tested by endless marches, and a king who seemed less Macedonian with each passing day. Alexander pushed on, quelling rebellions, founding cities, and blending his court with Persian nobles. He adopted the proskenses, a Persian custom of bowing, alienating his men further. Yet his charisma held them, his victories a reminder of why they followed. The Sogdian Rock, a fortress deemed impregnable, fell when Alexander's climbers scaled its cliffs under cover of night, a feat that left the defenders awestruck. By 327 BC, Central Asia was pacified, though never fully tamed. Alexander's empire now stretched from Greece to the Oxus River, a realm vast but fragile, held together by his will alone. His men, exhausted, dreamed of Macedon's hills, but Alexander's eyes turned further east to India, where new horizons beckoned. The cost of his ambition was growing, friends lost, loyalties strained, and a heart heavy with choices that could not be undone. As he stood on the banks of the Oxus, Roxana at his side, he knew the road ahead would demand more than he had yet given. As the night wraps us in its quiet embrace, picture Alexander gazing across that river, the water reflecting a sky heavy with stars. Did he see the empire he had built, or the cracks beginning to form? Did he hear the call of distant lands, or the whispers of men who longed for home? The answer lies beyond the mountains, in a land of rivers and rains, where a king's dream will face its fiercest test. The monsoon rains of 326 BC drenched the plains of India, turning rivers into torrents and the earth into a sea of mud. Alexander, now 29, stood at the edge of his empire, the Hindu Kush behind him, its snow-capped peaks a fading memory of the trials in Bactria and Sogdiana. The conquest of Central Asia had stretched his army to its limits, but Alexander's ambition burned brighter than ever, undimmed by years of war or the whispers of discontent among his men. India, a land of fabled wealth and ancient kingdoms, lay before him, its rivers gleaming under a sky heavy with promise and peril. Here, at the edge of the known world, Alexander would face the Battle of Hydaspes, a clash that would test his genius and reveal the growing cost of his unrelenting dream. India was a world unlike any Alexander had encountered. Its jungles teemed with life, its cities pulsed with color, and its people worshipped gods unknown to Greece or Persia. The Macedonian army, now a blend of cultures, Greeks, Persians, and Bactrians marching beside the phalanx, crossed the Indus River, welcomed by local rulers who saw alliance as wiser than resistance. Taxiles, king of Taxila, offered tribute and friendship, his gifts of gold and elephants a marvel to the Macedonians. But beyond the Indus lay the kingdom of Porus, a warrior king whose pride matched Alexander's own. Porus ruled the Punjab, his army a formidable force of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. Their towering forms a terror to men unaccustomed to such beasts. Alexander's scouts brought word of Porus's position. Encamped on the far bank of the Hydaspes River, its waters swollen by rains, its currents a barrier as daunting as Tyre's walls. The Macedonian army, numbering some 20,000, faced a force of equal size, but Porus's elephants, perhaps 200 strong, gave him an edge no Persian army had wielded. Alexander, studying the river from its muddy banks, knew a direct crossing would be suicide. His men, weary from years of march, watched their king with a mix of awe and exhaustion. Hephaestion, ever loyal, planned logistics, while Ptolemy scouted the terrain. Coeneus, a trusted general, spoke for the men, his voice heavy with their unspoken longing for home. The battle that followed was a masterstroke of Alexander's genius. For days, he fainted, marching his army up and down the riverbank by night, lighting fires to confuse Porus's scouts. The Indian king, vigilant, kept his forces ready, but the constant maneuvering wore his men thin. Then, under cover of a stormy night, Alexander led a select force of 15,000 cavalry, archers, and light infantry, 17 miles upstream to a hidden ford. The rain lashed down, masking their movements, as they crossed the swollen river on rafts and inflated hides. By dawn, they were on Porus's side, a lightning bolt poised to strike. Porus, realizing the deception, turned to meet Alexander, leaving part of his army to guard the main camp. The Battle of Hydaspes began on a rain-soaked plain, the ground slick with mud, the air thick with the trumpeting of elephants. Alexander opened with his cavalry, the companions charging Porus's left flank, while his archers targeted the elephants' drivers, sowing chaos. The beasts, maddened by wounds, trampled friend and foe alike, their roars drowning out the clash of steel. The Macedonian phalanx, disciplined despite the alien terrain, advanced slowly, their sarissas holding the Indian infantry at bay. Alexander, on Bucephalus, led a decisive charge, breaking Porus's cavalry and turning the tide. The battle was brutal, the mud red with blood, the air heavy with cries. Porus, towering atop his elephant, fought with the courage of a king, rallying his men until the end. But Macedonian discipline prevailed, and the Indian line collapsed. Thousands fell, including 2 of Porus's sons, their deaths a blow to their father's heart. When the dust settled, Porus stood defeated but unbowed, his towering frame bloodied yet proud. Alexander, meeting him, was struck by his dignity. "How would you be treated?" he asked. Porus replied, "As a king." Impressed, Alexander restored him to his throne as a vassal, a gesture that won loyalty where force might have failed. The victory at Hydaspes was a triumph, but it came at a cost. Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved stallion, fell, wounded or exhausted, his loss a wound to the king's heart. Alexander buried him with honors, founding a city, Bucephala, in his memory. The army, too, bore scars, hundreds dead, thousands weary, their bodies battered by rain and battle. The elephants, a new terror, left the Macedonians shaken, and the endless march weighed on their souls. As Alexander gazed across the Hydaspes, he dreamed of pressing further, to the Ganges and beyond, where India's mysteries waited. But his men, for the first time, began to falter, their eyes turning westward to the homes they had not seen in years. The triumph over Porus added another jewel to Alexander's crown, but it also marked a turning point. The army camped in the Punjab, the rains unceasing, the air thick with the scent of earth and loss. Hephaestion planned new campaigns, but Coenus and others spoke of rest, their voices a quiet rebellion. Alexander, standing by Bucephala's grave, felt the weight of his ambition, a dream that burned brighter than his men's strength. India stretched before him, vast and uncharted, but the path was no longer clear. What would it take to push beyond the Hydaspes, and at what cost? As the night enfolds us, picture Alexander by that river, the rain washing the blood from his armor, the ghost of Bucephalus at his side. Did he see the empires still to conquer, or the men who could march no further? Did he hear the call of glory, or the quiet plea of those who followed him? The answer lies at the Hiphasis, where a king's dream will meet the limits of human endurance. The rains of India fell unrelenting in 326 BC, cloaking the Punjab in a veil of mist and mud. Alexander, now 29, stood at the edge of his empire, the Hydaspes River behind him, its waters a testament to his triumph over Porus. The Macedonian army, battle-scarred and weary, camped amid the lush plains, their tents sodden, their hearts heavy with a decade of conquest. From the hills of Macedon to the jungles of India, they had followed their king across a world remade in his image, their sarissas carving an empire that stretched from Greece to the edge of the known. Yet, as Alexander gazed eastward to the Hiphasis River, his dreams of further glory clashed with the limits of human endurance. Here, at the farthest reach of his ambition, a moment of reckoning loomed, a turning point that would echo through history. The Punjab was a land of abundance, its fields rich with rice and sugar cane, its rivers teeming with life. The victory at Hydaspes had won Alexander the loyalty of Porus, now a vassal king, and the allegiance of other Indian rulers. Taxilla's wealth flowed into Macedonian coffers, and tales of Alexander's deeds spread, mingling with India's ancient myths. But the army, a mosaic of Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, and new recruits, was stretched thin. 10 years of march and battle had left them gaunt, their armor patched, their bodies marked by scars from Granicus to Sogdiana. The elephants of Hydaspes, though defeated, haunted their dreams, and rumors of greater kingdoms beyond the Hiphasis, armies with thousands of elephants, stirred fear in even the bravest hearts. Alexander, undaunted, planned to press on. Scouts reported vast plains and the mighty Ganges, a river said to dwarf the Nile. To Alexander, it was the edge of the world, a horizon where his destiny could unfold. He spoke of uniting East and West, of a realm where all peoples shared one culture, one king. Hephaestion, his closest confidant, shared this vision, his eyes bright with the dream of a world remade. Ptolemy, ever practical, ensured supplies, while Coenus and Craterus, loyal generals, rallied the men. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. The rains, ceaseless and oppressive, mirrored the mood of an army that longed for Macedon's hills, for wives and children left behind a lifetime ago. The march to the Hiphasis was grueling, the roads churned to mud, the rivers swollen. Alexander led as always, his presence a beacon, his voice urging the men forward. He spoke of glory, of riches beyond imagining, but his words, once a fire that warmed their souls, now met weary silence. The men followed, their loyalty to their king unshaken, but their steps grew heavier, their gazes turning westward. At the Hiphasis, Alexander halted, intending to cross and face whatever lay beyond. He called his generals to a council, his plans laid out with the fervor of a man possessed. The Ganges beckoned, and with it, the promise of immortality. But Coenus, grizzled and steadfast, spoke what others dared not. Standing before the king, his voice steady but heavy, he pleaded for the army. "We have followed you to the ends of the earth," he said, "but we are men, not gods. Our bodies tire, our hearts ache for home." The words hung in the air, a truth Alexander could not ignore. The army, gathered nearby, echoed Coenus's plea, their murmurs a chorus of exhaustion. For the first time, Alexander saw not just soldiers but men, fathers, brothers, sons, who had given all they had. He withdrew to his tent, refusing to speak, hoping his silence would reignite their fire. 3 days he waited, but the army's resolve held firm. They would march no further. Alexander, his heart torn between ambition and loyalty, sought a sign from the gods. He offered sacrifices, but the omens were unfavorable, the entrails speaking of retreat. Whether divine will or a king's reluctant acceptance, Alexander yielded. He announced the return, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of loss. The army cheered, their relief a tidal wave, though some wept for their king, knowing what it cost him. Alexander ordered 12 great altars built on the Hyphasis, monuments to their journey's end, their stones a testament to a dream deferred. The march back began, not in defeat, but in a fragile truce between a king's will and his men's limits. The decision was a wound to Alexander's soul. He had cut the Gordian knot, toppled Tyre's walls, and claimed the title of pharaoh, but here, at the Hyphasis, he met a barrier no sword could sever. The army turned westward, toward the Indus, their path now a journey homeward, though Alexander's heart still burned for what lay beyond. Hephaestion, ever his mirror, walked beside him, while Ptolemy and the others prepared for the long road ahead. The empire, vast and sprawling, demanded governance, and rebellions still flickered in its far corners. The Hyphasis was not an end, but a pivot, a moment that reshaped the path of a king and his men. As the night cloaks us in its gentle embrace, picture Alexander by those altars on the Hyphasis, the river's murmur mingling with the rain, his eyes tracing a horizon he would never reach. Did he feel the sting of a dream denied, or the weight of an empire that now rested on his shoulders? Did he hear the call of home, or the echo of battles yet to come? The answer lies in the desert that awaits, where a king's return will be as perilous as his conquests. The Indian sun of 325 BC burned low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the muddy banks of the Hyphasis River, where Alexander's altars stood as silent sentinels to a dream deferred. At 29, he was the master of an empire that spanned from Greece to the Punjab, its cities and peoples bound by his will. Yet, the refusal of his army to march further east had forced a turning point, and now the Macedonian king faced a new challenge: the long road home. The journey back to Persia, through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert and across treacherous rivers, would test Alexander's leadership as fiercely as any battle. The path was not one of triumph, but of survival, and the cost would carve deep scars into the hearts of his men and the soul of their king. The march began with a descent down the Indus River, a lifeline through India's lush but perilous lands. Alexander, ever restless, did not simply retreat. He waged war as he went, subduing tribes that resisted his passage. The Malians, a fierce people of the Punjab, defied him, their warriors striking from fortified towns. At one such siege, Alexander scaled a city wall, only to find himself isolated, a lone figure atop the battlements. Arrows rained down, and a dart pierced his lung, his blood pooling on the baked earth. His men, frantic, stormed the city to save him, their fury a testament to their love for their king. Hephaestion and Ptolemy carried him from the fray, his life hanging by a thread. For days he lay near death, the army holding its breath, fearing the loss of the man who was their world. Alexander recovered, his will as unyielding as the desert sun, but the incident shook his men. They saw their king's mortality, a crack in the divine aura Siwa's oracle had bestowed. To rally their spirits, Alexander sailed down the Indus, founding new Alexandrias and securing alliances with local kings. He reached the Indian Ocean, where he gazed upon its endless waves, a mirror of the horizons he could no longer chase. Here, he divided his forces. Part of the army under Craterus would return through the Balen Pass, a safer route with supplies. Alexander, ever drawn to the impossible, chose the Gedrosian desert for himself and the bulk of his forces. A path few had survived, its sands a graveyard of bones bleached white. The Gedrosian desert was a wasteland of blistering heat and shifting dunes, stretching across what is now southern Pakistan. No river softened its cruelty, no oasis broke its monotony. Alexander's army, some 30,000 strong, marched into its jaws, their water skins emptying too soon, their rations dwindling. The sun scorched by day, the cold bit by night, and the sand swallowed men and beasts alike. Pack animals collapsed, their carcasses left to rot, while stragglers fell behind, lost forever. Alexander marched among his men, sharing their thirst, refusing water when there was not enough for all. His presence was a beacon, but even his charisma could not silence the groans of hunger or the cries of those who fell. The desert claimed thousands. Some say half the army perished, though numbers blur in the haze of history. The survivors emerged gaunt, their eyes hollow, their loyalty to Alexander a flickering flame. Hephaestion, ever at his side, bore the losses like a personal wound, while Ptolemy, tasked with recording the march, etched the ordeal into his memory. The Gedrosian crossing was no triumph, but a trial that forged a deeper bond between king and men, those who survived forever marked by the shared suffering. Alexander, too, was changed, his face lined with the weight of lives lost, his dreams tempered by the reality of what his ambition demanded. When the army reached Pura, a city on the desert's edge, they found water and rest, their bodies reviving but their spirits slow to heal. Alexander sent for supplies, and the empire's governors answered, their caravans a lifeline to the survivors. Yet the march had exposed cracks in the empire. Satraps, left to govern distant provinces, had grown corrupt, hoarding wealth or plotting rebellion. Alexander, his trust shaken, purged his administration, executing those who had betrayed his vision. The empire, vast and sprawling, was a tapestry fraying at the edges, held together only by the force of his will. As the army rejoined Craterus in Carmania, celebrations masked the underlying strain. Alexander offered sacrifices to the gods, his voice strong but his heart heavy. The road to Babylon lay ahead, a return to the empire's heart, but it was no homecoming. The men dreamed of Macedon, of olive groves and familiar faces, while Alexander's mind turned to new conquests, Arabia, perhaps, or the lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Gedrosian ordeal had tested his limits, but it had not quenched his fire. Yet the question lingered. How much further could he push those who followed him? As the night drapes its quiet veil over us, picture Alexander in the desert's heart, his men stumbling behind him, the stars above the only guide through that endless waste. Did he feel the weight of those lost, or the pull of a destiny still unfulfilled? Did he see the empire he had built, or the fragility of a dream stretched too thin? The answer lies in Babylon, where a king's plans and a man's mortality will collide in the shadow of a palace. The spring of 323 BC bathed Babylon in a golden haze, its palaces gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, their walls a testament to empires older than memory. Alexander, now 32, returned to the heart of his conquests, a king whose name echoed from the Aegean to the Indus. The Gedrosian desert had scarred his army, its sands claiming thousands, but it had not dimmed the fire in his heart. Babylon, with its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, was the seat of his empire, a crossroads of cultures where East met West. Yet, as Alexander entered its gates, a shadow hung over him, not of defeat but of something deeper, a weariness that clung like dust to his soul. The final days of his life would unfold here, a tapestry of plans, omens, and a sudden end that would leave the world forever changed. Babylon was a city alive with the pulse of Alexander's vision. Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Bactrians mingled in its markets, their languages blending like the rivers that fed the land. Alexander, now fully embracing his role as great king, sought to bind his empire through unity. He ordered mass weddings at Susa, marrying his Macedonian generals to Persian noblewomen, 90 unions in a single day, with Alexander himself taking Statira, Darius's daughter, as a second wife. Hephaestion, his closest friend, wed her sister, their bond now sealed by blood. The Macedonians grumbled, their pride chafing at Persian customs, but Alexander saw beyond their discontent, envisioning a world where all were one under his crown. His plans grew ever grander. He spoke of conquering Arabia, its spice roots a glittering prize. He dreamed of sailing west, to Carthage and the Pillars of Hercules, where the world's edge waited. Engineers designed fleets, while scribes recorded his decrees, their hands trembling at the scope of his ambition. Yet the empire groaned under its own weight. Satraps rebelled in distant provinces, their greed unchecked, and Alexander's purges grew harsher, his trust in men thinning. The army, once a brotherhood forged in battle, was now a sprawling host, its Macedonian core diluted by new recruits. The death of Cleitus still haunted Alexander, a wound that festered in quiet moments, and the eyes of his companions, Ptolemy, Craterus, Seleucus, held a mix of loyalty and unspoken fear. Omens darkened the horizon. As Alexander approached Babylon, priests of Marduk warned him not to enter, their voices trembling with visions of doom. A Chaldean seer spoke of a king's death, and a strange man, unknown to the court, sat briefly on Alexander's throne, an act that chilled the palace. Alexander, ever attentive to the gods, offered sacrifices, but the entrails were grim, the skies unyielding. He dismissed the warnings, his laughter masking a flicker of unease, and entered Babylon, his presence a blaze of light in a city of shadows. His men, weary from the Gedrosian march, found solace in wine and revelry, but their king's mind raced, planning campaigns that stretched beyond mortal reach. In May, tragedy struck. Hephaestion, the companion who had shared Alexander's dreams since boyhood, fell ill with a fever. For days, he lingered, his strength fading until death claimed him. Alexander's grief was a storm, his cries echoing through Babylon's halls. He ordered a funeral pyre worthy of a god, its flames consuming gold and incense, and declared Hephaestion a hero, divine in death. The loss was a wound deeper than any battle scar, for Hephaestion had been his mirror, the one who understood his heart. Alexander wandered the palace, sleepless, his eyes hollow, as if part of his soul had burned with the pyre. The king rallied, as he always had, throwing himself into plans. He organized games, feasts, and naval preparations, his energy a defiance of fate. But in June, as the Tigris flowed lazily past Babylon's walls, Alexander fell ill. A fever gripped him, mild at first but relentless. He continued to hold court, drinking with his generals, his voice strong even as his body weakened. Days passed, the fever worsening until he could no longer stand. His men, sensing the end, filed past his bedside, their faces etched with dread. Alexander, too weak to speak, raised his hand to each, his eyes burning with the fire that had carried him across the world. On June 10 or 11, 323 BC, he breathed his last, his body stilled at 32, his empire an unfinished dream. The cause of his death remains a mystery. Some whispered of poison, a plot by those who feared his growing power. Others spoke of disease, malaria, perhaps, or the toll of wounds and exhaustion. The truth lies buried in Babylon's dust, a secret the gods have kept. His men wept, their grief a tide that flooded the city, while the empire trembled, its unity fraying without its king. Alexander left no clear heir, his unborn son by Roxana too young, his generals too divided. The world he had forged stood on the edge of chaos, its future unwritten. As the night wraps us in its gentle hush, picture Alexander on his deathbed, the lamplight flickering on his face, the murmurs of his men a distant song. Did he see the empire he had built, or the dreams he would never chase? Did he hear the gods calling, or the silence of a world left behind? The answer lies in the legacy he left, a flame that burns through the ages, even as his empire crumbles. The torches of Babylon burned low in the summer of 323 BC, their flickering light casting shadows over a city in mourning. Alexander, the king who had conquered a world, was gone, his breath stilled at 32, leaving an empire that stretched from the Ionian Sea to the banks of the Indus. His death was not just the end of a man, but the shattering of a dream, a vision of a world united under one crown, where East and West wove together like threads in a tapestry. As his body lay in state, surrounded by weeping soldiers and silent generals, the question hung heavy in the air. What becomes of an empire when its heart no longer beats? The legacy of Alexander, a flame that burned across continents, would endure, but its light would cast both brilliance and shadow, shaping history in ways even he could not have foreseen. In the days following his death, Babylon became a cauldron of ambition. Alexander had named no clear heir. His son by Roxana, born months later, was too young to rule, and his half-brother, Arihideus, was unfit to lead. The generals, once bound by loyalty to their king, turned on one another, their eyes gleaming with the hunger for power. Ptolemy, ever loyal, took Alexander's body to Egypt, where it was enshrined in Alexandria, the city that bore his name. There it became a symbol, a relic of a god-king whose legend grew with each passing year. The empire fractured, its pieces claimed by the Diadochi, the successors, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Antigonus in Greece, and others who carved kingdoms from the wreckage. These wars of the Diadochi were a storm, their battles raging for decades, as each sought to claim Alexander's mantle. Cities founded in his name, Alexandria in Egypt, Bucephala on the Hydaspes, dozens more, became beacons of Greek culture, their libraries and markets blending Hellenic thought with Eastern wisdom. The Hellenistic age was born, a fusion of philosophies, arts, and peoples that reshaped the world. In Alexandria, the library became a lighthouse of knowledge, drawing scholars who studied the stars and the soul, their work echoing Alexander's dream of unity. Yet the cost was high. His empire, meant to be one, became a mosaic of rival kingdoms, their borders drawn in blood. Alexander's legacy was not just in stone or conquest, but in the ideas he sowed. He had married East and West, blending Persian robes with Macedonian spears, Greek philosophy with Egyptian mysticism. His vision of a cosmopolitan world, where all were equal under one ruler, was revolutionary, a spark that burned long after his death. Traders carried Greek coins to India, where they mingled with local scripts. Poets sang of his deeds in languages he never spoke. The Silk Road, though not yet named, bore his influence, its paths trodden by merchants who carried more than goods. They carried the memory of a king who had walked to the world's edge. Yet his legacy was also a cautionary tale. His ambition, boundless and brilliant, had driven men to feats unimaginable, but it had also broken them. The Gedrosian Desert, the rains of India, the loss of Hephaestion, all were scars on those who followed him. His ruthlessness, Parmenian's execution, Cleitus's death, revealed a man whose divinity came at the cost of his humanity. Historians, then and now, wrestle with his contradictions. A liberator who enslaved, a unifier who divided, a dreamer who left chaos in his wake. Was he a hero, a god, or a man consumed by his own fire? The answer shifts like sand, each age seeing him anew. In Greece, his name became a legend, a story told to children under olive trees. In Persia, he was both destroyer and heir, his memory woven into tales of kings. In India, his battles lingered in oral traditions, a warrior king who fought rivers and elephants. His cities, from Alexandria to Kandahar, stood as monuments, their streets alive with the pulse of a world he had reshaped. Even Rome, rising centuries later, looked to him, its emperors measuring themselves against his shadow. Julius Caesar, standing before Alexander's tomb, wept, feeling his own deeds pale in comparison. Napoleon, too, carried his story, a map of conquest drawn by a Macedonian's hand. The man himself was gone, but his spirit lingered. Roxana's son, Alexander IV, was murdered in the Wars of Succession, his lines snuffed out. Yet the idea of Alexander endured, a flame that neither time nor war could extinguish. Philosophers debated his ethics, poets sang his triumphs, and dreamers gazed at the stars, wondering what might have been had he lived. Did he know, in those final fevered days, the mark he would leave? Did he see the world he had forged, or only the horizons he would never reach? As the night enfolds us, picture those altars on the Hyphasis, their stones weathered but standing, a testament to a king who reached the edge of the world. Picture Alexandria, its lighthouse piercing the dark, a beacon of his dream. Feel the weight of his name, carried on the wind across centuries, a whisper of glory and loss. What did he leave behind? A world united, or a dream too vast for mortal hands? The answer lies not in the past, but in the stories we tell, the echoes of a man who dared to chase the infinite. As the embers of our tale fade into the quiet of the night, we stand at the edge of Alexander's world, where his footsteps echo across the sands of time. From the rugged hills of Macedon to the distant rivers of India, he carved a path no mortal had dared before, a journey of fire and ambition, of triumphs that shook empires and losses that scarred the soul. His life was a comet, blazing bright and brief, leaving a trail that still lights our imagination. In his cities, from Alexandria's bustling harbors to Bucephala's silent plains, his dream of a united world lingers, a whisper of what might have been. Yet his story is not just one of conquest, but of a man who reached for the stars, only to find the weight of mortality. As you drift towards sleep, let Alexander's tale wrap around you, a reminder that even the greatest dreams are woven with sacrifice and hope. This journey through history is one I'm honored to share with you, my fellow dreamers and seekers of the past. If Alexander's story has stirred your heart or lulled you into a moment of peace, I invite you to join our community of storytellers. Click the like button to let me know you were here, and subscribe to my channel for more tales that blend history with the gentle rhythm of the night. Share this video with someone who loves the past as much as you do, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, or which moment of Alexander's life resonated with you most. Your voice keeps these stories alive, like torches in the dark. Until our next journey, this is Sherry, wishing you restful dreams and endless wonder. Good night.